Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
Night Without End by Alistair MacLean. Night Without End.
Chapter 7, Tuesday 7 a.m., Tuesday midnight. My gun. Mahler had slowly lifted his arms until his hands were at shoulder level, and his voice wasn't quite steady. I don't understand. Dr. Mason, I have no gun. Naturally, I jerked the barrel of the Beretta to lend emphasis to my words. Turn round. What are you going to do? You're making a dash. Turn round. He turned. I took a couple of steps forward, ground the muzzle of the automatic none too gently into the small of his back, and started to search him with my free hand. He was wearing 2 overcoats, a jacket, several sweaters and scarves, 2 pairs of trousers, and layer upon layer of underclothes. Searching him was easier said than done. It took me a full minute to convince myself that he wasn't carrying a weapon of any kind. I stepped back, and he came slowly round to face me. I hope you're quite satisfied now, Dr. Mason. We 11 see what we find in your case. As for the rest, I'm satisfied enough. I have all the proof I want. I dipped the torch beam to illuminate the handful of sugar I'd taken from the pocket of his inner overcoat. There had been well over a pound in either pocket. You might care to explain where you got this from, Mr. Mahler? I don't have to tell you that, do I? His voice was very low. I stole it, Dr. Mason. You did indeed. Remarkably small-time activity for a person who operates on the scale you do. It was just your bad luck, Mahler, that I happened to be looking directly at you when the theft of the sugar was mentioned back in the cabin. It was just your bad luck that when we had our coffee just now it was dark enough for me to have a swig from your cup without your knowledge. It was so stiff with sugar that I couldn't even drink the damn stuff. Curious, isn't it, Mahler, that such a tiny thing as giving way to a momentary impulse of greed should ruin everything? But I believe it's always the way. The big slip-up never brings the big criminal to book, because he never makes any. If you'd left that sugar alone when you were smashing up the valves, I'd never have known. Incidentally, what did you do with the rest of the sugar? In your grip? Or just thrown away? You're making a very grave mistake, Dr. Mason. Mahler's voice was steady now, and if it held any trace of worry or guilt, I couldn't detect it. But I was now far beyond the naive stage of expecting to detect anything of the sort. I didn't touch those valves, and apart from a few handfuls I took, the sugar bag was quite intact when I left it. Of course. I waved the Beretta. Back to the tractor, my friend, and let's have a look at this case of yours. No. Don't be crazy, I snapped. I have a gun, Mahler. Believe me, I won't hesitate to use it. I believe you. I think you would be quite ruthless if the need arose. Oh, I don't doubt you're tough, doctor, as well as being headstrong, impulsive, and not very subtle, but because I rather respect your efficient and selfless handling of an awkward and ugly situation for which you were in no way responsible, I don't want to see you make a complete fool of yourself in public. He lifted his right hand towards the lapel of his coat. Let me show you something. I jerked the Beretta forward, but the gesture was quite needless. As he pushed his hand under his topcoats, Mahler's gestures were smooth and unhurried, just as smooth and unhurried when he brought his hand out again and passed over to me a leather-covered card. I stepped back a few feet, flipped open the card, and glanced down at it. That one glance was enough, or should have been enough. I'd seen these cards scores of times before, but I stared down at this one as if I'd never seen one in my life. This was a completely new factor. It knocked all my preconceived notions on the head, and I needed time for reorient, a tie-in for understanding, for quelling the professional fear that came hard on the heels of that understanding. Then, slowly, I folded the card, pulled down my snow mask, stepped close to Mahler, and pulled his down also. In the harsh glare of the torch, his face was blue and white with the cold, and I could see the jutting of the jaw muscles as he clamped his teeth together to keep them from chattering uncontrollably. "Breathe out," I said. He did as I asked, and there was no mistaking it, none at all. The sweet acetone breath of the advanced and untreated diabetic can't possibly be confused with anything else. Wordlessly, I handed him back the card and thrust the automatic into my parka pocket. At last I said quietly, "How long have you had this, Mr. Mahler?" 30 years. A pretty advanced condition. When it came to discussing a man's illness with him, I had little time for the professional reticence of many of my colleagues. Besides, the average elderly diabetic had survived to that age simply because he was intelligent about the dietary and medical treatment of his trouble and usually knew all about it. My doctor would agree with you. I caught the smile on his face as he pushed his mask up, and there wasn't much humor in it. So would I. "Twice daily injections?" "Twice," he nodded, "before breakfast and in the evening." "But don't you carry a hypo and dash?" Normally, he interrupted, "But not this time. The Gander doctor gave me a jab, and as I can usually carry on a few hours overdue without ill effects, I thought I'd wait until we got to London." He tapped his breast pocket. "This card's good anywhere." "Except on the Greenland ice cap," I said bitterly. "But then, I don't suppose you anticipated a stop over here. What diet were you on?" "High protein, high starch." "Hence the sugar?" I looked down at the white crystals still clenched in my left mitten. "No." He shrugged. "But I know sugar used to be used for the treatment of coma. I thought maybe if I stuffed enough into myself. Well, anyway, you know now why I turned criminal." "Yes, I know now. My apologies for the gun-waving act, Mr. Mahler, but you must admit I had every justification. Why in the hell didn't you tell me before now? I am supposed to be a doctor, you know. I would have had to tell you sooner or later, I suppose. But right now you'd plenty of troubles of your own without worrying about mine also. And I didn't think there would be much chance of your carrying insulin among your medical stores. We don't have to. Everybody gets a thorough medical before going on an IGY station, and diabetes hardly develops overnight. You take it all very calmly, I must say, Mr. Mahler. Come on, let's get back to the tractor." We reached there inside a minute. I pulled back the canvas screen, and a thick, white opaque cloud formed almost immediately as the relatively warm air inside met the far sub-zero Arctic air outside. I waved my hand to dispel it and peered inside. They were all still drinking coffee. It was the one thing we had in plenty. It seemed difficult to realize that we'd been gone only a few minutes. Hurry up and finish off, I said abruptly. We're on our way within 5 minutes. Jackstraw, would you start the engine, please, before she chills right down? On our way. The protest almost inevitably came from Mrs. Dansby Gregg. My dear man, we've hardly stopped, and you promised us 3 hours sleep only a few minutes ago. That was a few minutes ago. That was before I found out about Mr. Mahler here. Quickly, I told them all I thought they needed to know. It sounds brutal to say it in Mr. Mahler's presence, I went on, but the facts themselves are brutal. Whoever crashed that plane, and to a lesser extent stole the sugar, put Mr. Mahler's life in the greatest danger. Only 2 things normally could save Mr. Mahler: a properly balanced high-calorie diet as a short-term measure, insulin as a long-term one. We have neither. All we can give Mr. Mahler is the chance to get one or other of these things with all speed humanly possible. Between now and the coast, that tractor engine is going to stop only if it packs in completely, if we run into an impassable blizzard, or if the last of the drivers collapses over the wheel. Are there any objections? It was a stupid, unnecessary, gratuitously truculent question to ask, but that's just the way I felt at that moment. I suppose really that I was inviting protest so that I could have some victim for working off the accumulated rage inside me, the anger that could find its proper outlet only against those responsible for this fresh infliction of suffering, the anger at the near certainty that no matter what effort we made to save Mahler, it would be completely nullified when the time came, as it inevitably must come, that the killers showed their hand. For one wild moment, I considered the idea of tying them all up, lashing them inside the tractor body so that they couldn't move, and had the conditions been right, I believe I would have done just that. But the conditions couldn't have been more hopeless. A bound person wouldn't have lasted a couple of hours in that bitter cold. There were no objections. For the most part, I suppose they were too cold, too tired, too hungry, and too thirsty, for with the rapid evaporation of moisture from the warm, relatively humid body, thirst was always a problem in dry, intensely cold air to raise any objections. To people unaccustomed to the Arctic, it must have seemed that they had reached the nadir of their sufferings, that things could get no worse than they were. I hoped as much time as possible would elapse before they found out how wrong they were. There were no objections, but there were 2 suggestions. Both came from Nick Corazzini. Look, Doc, about this diet Mr. Mahler must have. Maybe we can't balance it, but we can at least make sure that he gets a fair number of calories. Not that I know how you count the damn things. Why don't we double his rations? No, even that wouldn't keep a decent sparrow alive. What say each of the rest of us docks a quarter of his rations and hands them over? That way, Mr. Mahler would have about 4 times his normal dash. No, no. Mahler protested. Thank you, Mr. Corazzini, but I cannot permit dash. An excellent idea, I interrupted. I was thinking along the same lines myself. Good, Corazzini grinned. Carried unanimously. I also suggest we get along farther and faster if, say, Mr. Zagero and I were to spell you 2 on the tractor. He held up a hand as if to forestall protest. Either of us may be the man you want. In fact, we might be the 2 men you want if it is 2 men. But if I'm one of the killers, and I know nothing about the Arctic, navigation, the maintenance of this damned Citroën, and wouldn't as much as recognize a crevasse if I fell down one. It's as plain as the nose on your face that I'm not going to make a break for it until I'm within shouting distance of the coast. Agreed? Agreed, I said. Even as I spoke, there came a coughing, clattering roar as Jackstraw coaxed the still warm Citroen back into life, and I looked up at Corzini. All right, I went on. Come on down. You can have your first driving lesson now. We left at 7:30 that morning in driving conditions that were just about perfect. Not the slightest breath of air stirred. Across the ice cap and the deep blue-black vault of the sky was unmarred by even the tiniest wisp of cloud. The stars were strangely remote, pale and shimmering and unreal through the gossamer gauze of the glittering ice needles that filled the sky and sifted soundlessly down on the frozen snow. But even so, visibility was all that could have been desired, the powerful headlights of the Citroen. Striking a million sparkling diamond points of light off the ice spicules, reached a clear 300 yards ahead into the darkness, leaving the ground to either side of the twin, interlocking beams shrouded in impenetrable darkness. The cold was intense and deepening by the hour, but the Citroen seemed to thrive on it that morning. Luck was with us almost right away. Within 15 minutes of starting off, Balto, ranging free as always, appeared out of the darkness to the southwest and ran alongside the dog sledge, barking to attract Jackstraw's attention. Jackstraw gave us the signal to stop, a rapid flickering of the red and green lights on the tractor dashboard, and in 2 or 3 minutes appeared out of the darkness, grinning, to tell us that Balto had picked up a standing trail flag. That was good news in itself, in that it meant that our navigation the previous night had been all that could have been wished for, and that we were almost exactly on course. Even more important, however, was the fact that if this flag was the first of a series, we could dispense with the navigator on the dog sledge and that jackstraw, and I could have some sleep, if sleep were possible, in that miserably cold and lurching tractor body. And, indeed, that flag proved to the first of an almost unbroken series that was to guide us all the length of that interminable day, so that from 8 o'clock onwards Jackstraw, Zagero, Corzini, and I took it in turns to drive, with the senator, the Reverend Smallwood, or Solly Levin up front as lookout. Theirs was probably the coldest, certainly the most unwelcome job of all, but all three bore up uncomplainingly, even to the extent of thawing out in silent agony at the end of their hour on duty. Shortly after 8 o'clock, I left an obviously competent Corzini to his own devices, dropped back to the shelter of the tractor body, and asked the senator to go up front. I then set about breaking the strictest rule of all where these old tractors were concerned, that no fire should ever be lit inside when they were in motion. But even the most stringent rules are to be observed only until such time as the need for breaking them is paramount, and now both the need and the time were here. My concern was not for the warmth and comfort of the passengers, or even for the cooking of the food. We had little enough of that, but even the most stringent rules are to be observed only until such time as the need for breaking them is paramount, and now both the need and the time were here. My concern was not for the warmth and comfort of the passengers, or even for the cooking of the food. We had little enough of that, heaven knew, though a constant supply of warm. Water would come in useful for dealing with the inevitable cases of frostbite, but purely and simply for the life of Theodore Mahler. Even following Corazzini's suggestion, we couldn't give him enough food, and what we could didn't and wouldn't even begin to resemble a balanced diet. His best chance of survival, and that was slender enough, lay in conserving his body reserves and his energy as far as lay within our power. To achieve that work or exercise of even the lightest kind was out. He had to remain as immobile as possible, which was why I had him climb into a sleeping bag and lie down on one of the bunks, wrapped in a pair of heavy blankets as soon as I entered. But without work or exercise, he would have no means to combat that numbing cold except by a constant shivering which would deplete his reserves just as quickly as the most violent exercise would. So he had to have heat. Heat from the stove, heat from the warm fluids which I told Margaret Ross that he was to have at least every 2 hours. Mahler protested strongly against all these arrangements being made on his behalf, but at the same time he was sensible enough to realize that his only chance of survival depended on doing what I said. But I believe that the main factor which finally made him yield was not so much my medical explanations as the pressure of public opinion. That all the passengers should suddenly and so vehemently be concerned with Theodore Mahler's welfare seemed, on the face of it, inexplicable. But only on the face of it. It did not require a great deal of thought or probing beneath the surface to discover that the true motivating factor was not selflessness, though there may have been some of that, too, but selfishness. Mahler represented not so much a sufferer as a most welcome diversion from their own thoughts and suspicions, from the tension, from the never-ending constraint that had laid its chilling hand over the entire company for the past 12 hours. This constraint, apart from its awkwardness and sheer unpleasantness, had the further effect of splitting up the passengers into tiny groups. Communal speech had ceased entirely, except where necessity and the barest demands of common politeness made it inevitable. Marie Lugard and Margaret Ross, each of whom knew that the other was not under suspicion, kept very much to themselves and talked only between themselves. So, too, did Zagero and Solly Levin, and also, though this would have seemed ridiculously improbable only 24 hours ago, Mrs. Dansby Gregg and her maid Helene. Improbable then, but inevitable now. Whether guilty or not, both knew exactly where the other stood, and of all the passengers, each could only fully trust the other. They could, of course, as could all the others, trust Marie Lugard and Margaret Ross. But the fact that they knew that Marie Lugard and Margaret Ross couldn't trust them was enough to prohibit any attempts to establish an easier relationship. As for Corazzini, the Rev Smallwood, the Senator, and Mahler, they kept very much to themselves. In the circumstances, then, it was inevitable that they should welcome the introduction of an absolutely innocuous subject of interest and conversation, something that would ease, however slightly, the coldness and discomfort of the social atmosphere. Something that would divert their unwelcome and suspicious thoughts into some more tolerable channel. Theodore Mahler promised to be the best looked-after patient I had ever had. I had just got the oil stove going to my satisfaction when Zagero called to me from his seat by the rear canvas screen. "There's something funny going on outside, document. Come and have a look." I had a look. Far off to the right, the northwest, that was, and high above the horizon, a great diffuse formless volume of luminosity, spreading over almost a quarter of the dark dome of the sky, was beginning to pulse and fade, strengthening, deepening. climbing with the passing of every moment. At first it was no more than a lightning in the sky, but already it was beginning to take form, and faint colors beginning to establish themselves in definite patterns. "The aurora, Mr. Zagero," I said. "The northern lights. First time you've seen it." He nodded. "Yeah, amazing spectacle, ain't it? This is nothing. It's just starting up. It's going to be a curtain. You get all sorts, rays, bands, coronas, arcs, and what have you. But this is a curtain. Best of a lot. Get this sort of thing often, Doc?" "Every day, 4 days on end, when the weather is like this, cold and clear and still. Believe it or not, you can even get so used to it that you won't bother looking." "I don't believe it. It's amazing," he repeated. "Just amazing. Tired of it. You say, minus one hope we see it every day." He grinned. "You don't have to look, document. For your own sake, you'd better hope for something else," I said grimly. "Meaning?" "Meaning that radio reception is hopeless when the aurora is on." "Radio reception?" He crinkled his brows. "What we gotta lose, with the radio set, in the cabin smashed, and your friends in the trail party getting further away every minute. You couldn't raise either of them anyway." "No, but we can raise our Uplavnik base when we get a bit nearer the coast," I said, and the next moment I could have bitten my tongue off. I had never even thought of the matter until then, but as soon as the words were out, I realized that I should have kept this piece of knowledge to myself. The chances of Uplavnik listening in at the right time and on the right frequency were remote enough, but it was always a chance. We could have sent out a warning, summoned help long before the killers would have thought of making a break for it. But now, if Zagero were one of the killers, he would make good and certain that the set would be smashed long before we got within radio range of the Uplavnik base. I cursed myself for a blundering idiot and stole a quick glance at Zagero. In the light streaming out from the gap in the curtain and in the fainter light of the aurora, his every feature was plain, but I could tell nothing from his expression. He was playing it casual, all right, but not too stupidly casual. The slow nod, the pursing of the lips, the thoughtful lifting of the eyebrows could not have been improved upon. Not even the best professional actor could have improved on it, and hard on the heels of that came the second thought that there were a couple of extraordinarily fine actors among us. But then, if he hadn't reacted at all, or had reacted too violently, I would have been doubly suspicious. Or would I? If Zagero were one of the guilty men, wouldn't he have known that too much or too little reaction would have been the very thing to excite suspicion, and taken due precaution against registering either? I gave it up and turned away. But in my mind there was growing a vague but steadily strengthening suspicion against Johnny Zagero, and on the basis of the success and validity of my previous suspicions, I thought bitterly that just about guaranteed Zagero's innocence. I turned and touched Margaret Ross on the shoulder. "I'd like to have a few words with you, Miss Ross, if you don't mind the cold outside." She looked at me in surprise, hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I jumped down, reached up a hand to steady her, then helped her aboard the big sled as it passed by a few seconds later. For a short time we just sat there, side by side on a petrol drum, watching the aurora while I wonder how to begin. I stared almost unseeingly at the tremendous sweep of the developing aurora, the great folded, fluted curtain of yellow-green with red-tipped feet, that seemed almost to brush the surface of the ice cap, a translucent, transparent drapery. For even at its brightest, the stars still shone faintly through, that waved and shimmered and pulsed and glowed, a pastel poem in insubstantiality, like the ethereal backdrop to some unimaginably beautiful fairyland. Margaret Ross sat there gazing at it like one lost in a trance, but she might have been looking at it with the same uncaring eyes as myself, lost not in wonder, but in the memory of the man we had left behind in the ice cap. And when she turned at the sound of my voice, and I saw the glow of the aurora reflected in the sad depths of the wide brown eyes, I knew I was right. Well, Miss Ross, what do you think of the latest development? Mr. Mahler? She'd slipped up her snow mask. In her case, just a gauze and cotton wool pad with a central breathing aperture. Andy had to lean forward to catch her soft voice. What can one say about anything SOSO dreadful? What chance does the poor man have, Dr. Mason? I've honestly no idea. There are far too many unpredictable factors involved. Did you know that after I'd crossed you off, I'd lined him up as number 1 on my list of suspects? No. But yes, I'm afraid. I fear I'm no sleuth, Miss Ross. I may be long on the empirical trial and error method, and it at least has had the negative advantage of reducing the number of suspects by 2, but I'm pretty short on the deductive. I told her what had happened between Mahler and myself during the brief stop we had made. And now you're as badly off as ever, she said when I had finished. I suppose all we can do now is to sit and wait to see what happens. Wait for the axe to fall, you mean? I said grimly. Not quite. I haven't much hope from it. But I thought I might try the deductive reasoning act for a change. But before we can deduce, we have to have some facts we can deduce from. And we're very short on facts. That's why I ask you out here to see if you could help me. Till do anything I can, you know that. She lifted her head as the aurora swelled and flamed to the incandescent climax of its performance, and shivered violently as its unearthly beautiful colorings struck a million sparks of colored light, red and green and yellow and gold, off the ice spicules in the sky. I don't know why. That makes me feel colder than ever. But I think I've already told you everything I know, everything I can remember, Dr. Mason. I'm sure you have. But you may have missed some things just because you couldn't see they mattered anyway. Now, as I see it, we have 3 big questions looking for an answer. How come the crash in the first place? How was the coffee spiked? How was the radio broken? If we can turn up anything that can throw a light on even one of these, we may be a long way towards finding out what we want to know. 10 freezing minutes later, we were still a long way from finding out anything. I'd taken Margaret Ross step by step from the customs hall, where she'd met her passengers, to the plane where she had settled them down, flown with them to Gander, watched them go through the same process again, flown them out of Gander, watched her as she'd served their evening meal, and still I'd learnt nothing, turned up nothing suspicious, offbeat, or abnormal that could even begin to account for the crash. Then, slowly, just as she was describing the serving of the meal, her voice trailed away into silence, and she turned and stared at me. "What's the matter, Miss Ross?" "Of course," she said softly. "Of course. What a fool I am. Now I see." "What do you see?" I demanded. "The coffee. How it was tampered with. I just served Colonel Harrison. He was in the rear seat, so he was the last to be served. When wrinkled his nose and asked if I could smell something burning. I couldn't, but I made some sort of joke about something burning on the galley hot plate, and I just got back there when I heard the colonel calling, and when I looked round, he had the door of the starboard washroom open and smoke was coming out. Not much, just a little. I called the captain, and he hurried aft to see what it was, but it was nothing serious, just a few papers burning. Somebody had been careless with a cigarette, I suppose, and everybody rose out of their seats and crowded to have a look. I asked grimly. Yes, Captain Johnson ordered them all back to their seats. They were upsetting the trim of the plane. And you didn't think this worth mentioning to me, I said heavily. No importance at all? I'm sorry. It did seem unimportant, unrelated to anything. That was hours before the crash, so dash. It doesn't matter. Who could have gone into the galley then? Anybody in the front seats, I suppose? Yes, they all seemed to crowd down past the middle dash. They? Who were they? I don't know. Why do you ask? Because by knowing who was there, we might find out who wasn't. I'm sorry, she repeated helplessly. I was a little upset for a moment, then Captain Johnson was in front of me shooing everybody back to their seats, and I couldn't see. All right. I changed my approach. This was the men's washroom, I take it? Yes, the powder room is on the port side. Can you remember who went in there? Say, any time up to an hour beforehand? An hour? But the cigarette and dash. Do you believe now that the fire was caused deliberately? I asked. Of course. She stared at me wide-eyed. Right, and we're dealing, obviously, with hardened professional criminals. The whole success of their plan depended on causing this excitement. Do you for a moment believe that they were going to let the whole thing hinge on the mere off chance of a smoldering butt end setting some papers alight, especially setting them alight at the correct moment? But how dash? Easy. You can get a little plastic tube with a central composition shield dividing it into two compartments. In one compartment, you have a free acid. In the other, a different acid enclosed in a glass tube. All you have to do is to crush the tube, break the glass, drop the tube in your chosen spot, walk away, and after a predetermined time, the acid that was in the glass eats through the shield, meets the other acid, and starts a fire. It's been used hundreds of times, especially in wartime sabotage. If you're an arsonist looking for a cast-iron alibi and want to be 5 miles away when the fire starts, it's the perfect answer. There way a funny smell, dash, she began slowly. You bet there was. Can you remember who went there? It's no good. She shook her head. I was in the galley most of the time, getting the meal ready. Who were in the front two seats, those nearest the galley? Miss Lugard and Mr. Corzini. And I'm afraid that's not much help. We know Marie Lugard can't have had anything to do with it. And Mr. Corzini is the one person I'm sure didn't leave his seat before dinner. He had a gin soon after takeoff, then switched off his reading light, draped a newspaper over his head, and went to sleep. Are you sure? Quite sure. I always peek through the cabin door from time to time, and he was always there. That seems to cut him out, I said thoughtfully. and reduce the number of suspects, though I suppose he could still have got an accomplice to plant the acid tube. Then suddenly I had what was for me an inspiration. Tell me, Miss Ross, did anyone ask you earlier in the evening when dinner would be? She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and even in the fading light of the aurora, I could see the understanding coming into her eyes. Mrs. Dansby Gregg did, I'm sure. She would. Anyone else? Yes, I remember now. Her voice was suddenly very quiet. Colonel Harrison, but he doesn't count any more, and Mr. Zagero. Zagero. In my excitement, I bent forward until my face was almost touching hers. Are you sure? I'm sure. I remember when he asked me, I said, "Are you feeling peckish, sir?" And he grinned and said, "My dear air hostess, I always feel peckish." Well, well, this is most interesting. Do you think Mr. Zagero dash? I'm at the stage where I'm afraid to think anything. I've been wrong too often. But it's a straw in the wind, all right. A straw about the size of a haystack. Was he anywhere near you when the radio fell? Behind you, for instance, when you rose and brushed against the radio table? No, he was by the hatch, I'm sure of that. Could he dash? He couldn't. Joss and I worked it out. Somebody had pushed one of the table hinges right home and the other until it was at the critical point of balance. Then, as you stood up, he pushed the other in. From a distance, there was a long-handled brush lying there. But had no significance for us at the time. When you heard the crash, you whirled round, didn't you? She nodded without speaking. And what did you see? Mr. Corazzini dash. We know he dived for it, I said impatiently. But in the background against the wall, there was someone. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. But no, it couldn't have been. He'd been sitting dozing on the floor, and he got the fright of his life when dash. For heaven's sake. I cut in harshly. Who was it? Solly Levin. The brief twilight of noon came and went, the cold steadily deepened, and by late in the evening it seemed that we had been on board that lurching, roaring tractor all our lives. Twice only we stopped in the course of that interminable day for refueling at 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. I chose these times because I had arranged with Joss that I would try to contact him every 4th hour. But though we set up the apparatus outside while Jackstraw was refueling and Corazzini sat astride the bicycle seat and cranked the generator handle, while I tapped out our call sign, for almost 10 unbroken minutes, no shadow of an answer came through. I had expected none. Even if by some miracle Joss had managed to fix the set, the ionosphere turbulence that had caused the aurora would have almost certainly killed any chance of making contact. But I'd promised Joss, and I had to keep faith. By the time I made the second try, everyone, even Jackstraw and myself, was shaking and shivering in the bitter cold. Normally, we wouldn't have felt it much. In very cold weather, we wore 2 complete sets of furs, the inner one with the fur inside, the outer with the fur outside. But we'd given our extra pairs away to Corazzini, and Zagero furs were essential in that icebox of a tractor cabin, and suffered just as much as the others. Occasionally, someone would jump down from the tractor and run alongside to try to get warm. But so exhausted were most from sleeplessness, hunger, cold, and eternally bracing themselves against the lurching of the tractor, that they were staggering from exhaustion within minutes, and had to come aboard again. And when they did come aboard, the sweat from their exertions in such heavy clothes turned ice cold on their bodies, putting them in worse case than ever, until finally I had to stop it. It grieved me to do what had to be done. What I saw must be done, but there was no help for it. The weariness, the cold, and the sleeplessness could be borne no longer. When I finally gave the order to stop, it was 10 minutes after midnight, and we had been driving continuously except for brief fuel and radio halts for 27 hours.
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.